Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke and Ridge's marriage is already in trouble. 3 shocking threats revealed. Brooke Logan stood alone in the Forrester living room long after the house had gone quiet, the soft glow from the city lights outside casting long shadows across the furniture that had witnessed decades of love, betrayal, forgiveness, and heartbreak. And for the first time since she and Ridge had remarried, she felt it in her bones, that unmistakable sense that something precious was already slipping through her fingers, because while the rings on their hands were new, the cracks in their marriage were old, familiar, and widening fast. And Brooke couldn't shake the thought that they had rushed back into forever, without truly reckoning with the ghosts that still lived between them. Ridge had gone upstairs hours earlier after yet another tense, unresolved conversation, one that started small, about work, about Steffi, about Thomas, but spiraled into something heavier, something loaded with unspoken accusations and old resentments neither of them wanted to fully name. And as Brooke replayed the argument in her mind, she realized with a sinking heart that their marriage was already under siege from 3 powerful threats, each one capable of tearing them apart on its own, and, together, almost impossible to survive. The first threat was the one neither of them liked to admit out loud. Taylor Hayes was back in Ridge's emotional orbit, not necessarily in body every day, but in spirit, in memory, and in the quiet moments when Ridge questioned his choices. Brooke had seen it in his eyes the moment Taylor returned to Los Angeles with her calm voice, her composed strength, and her unwavering belief that she and Ridge shared a destiny that Brooke could never fully erase. Taylor didn't have to scheme or seduce or sabotage. Her very presence reopened wounds Brooke thought had finally healed. Ridge insisted that Taylor was simply the mother of his children, that he respected her, cared about her well-being, and nothing more, but Brooke knew Ridge better than anyone, and she knew that when Taylor was near, Ridge became reflective, conflicted, pulled between who he was and who he thought he should be. Every time Steffi praised her mother, every time Thomas leaned on Taylor for guidance, Brooke felt herself slowly being pushed to the margins of Ridge's family, like an outsider looking in on a life she was supposed to be at the center of. And the most dangerous part wasn't Taylor's intentions, it was Ridge's hesitation, the way he didn't shut things down decisively, the way he left doors cracked open instead of firmly closed, and Brooke couldn't help wondering if Ridge had married her because she was truly his choice, or because walking away from her yet again felt too exhausting, too final. The second threat came from a place even closer to home, and far more volatile. Thomas Forrester, whose complicated history with Brooke was a ticking time bomb neither she nor Ridge could afford to ignore. Thomas had claimed he'd changed, that therapy had helped him confront his darkness, that he wanted peace for his family, but Brooke's instincts screamed that something was still dangerously unresolved. She didn't trust Thomas, not with Ridge, not with hope, and certainly not with the fragile stability of her marriage. Every time Thomas looked at her with that tight smile, every time he framed himself as the misunderstood victim and Brooke as the eternal obstacle to Ridge's happiness, she felt the walls closing in. Ridge accused Brooke of being unfair, of refusing to let the past stay in the past, but Brooke couldn't forget the manipulation, the lies, the way Thomas had nearly destroyed Hope's life and her own, and worst of all, the way Ridge had repeatedly chosen to believe his son over his wife. That pattern hadn't disappeared just because they'd said, "I do" again. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, and Brooke feared that it would only take one accusation, one misunderstanding, one carefully planted doubt from Thomas to send Ridge spiraling back into defensiveness and mistrust. The truth Brooke was too afraid to say out loud was this: as long as Ridge refused to hold Thomas fully accountable, her marriage would never be safe. And then there was the third threat, the most insidious one of all: Brooke and Ridge themselves. Their shared history so long entangled that it often felt heavier than love. They had hurt each other in every way 2 people possibly could, and while they always found their way back, each reunion came with less innocence and more emotional scar tissue. Brooke wondered if they were addicted to the drama, to the passion, to the idea that no matter how badly they broke each other, fate would pull them back together. But fate, she was learning, was not the same as compatibility, and love alone couldn't fix what trust issues, jealousy, and unresolved resentment continued to corrode. Ridge still bristled at Brooke's independence, her need to speak her mind, her refusal to blindly accept his version of events, while Brooke was exhausted by Ridge's moral double standards. his tendency to forgive himself and his children instantly while holding Brooke to an impossible standard of perfection. Their arguments escalated faster now, cooled slower, and ended less completely, leaving emotional debris behind that neither of them quite knew how to clean up. The tension finally exploded one evening, when a seemingly innocent family dinner turned into an emotional minefield. Steffi praised Taylor for always being there, and subtly questioned whether Brooke truly understood Ridge the way her mother did. And Thomas, with carefully chosen words, suggested that stability, not passion, was what Ridge needed at this stage in his life. Brooke felt ambushed, cornered in her own home, and when she looked to Ridge for support, she found him silent, conflicted, torn between defending his wife and keeping the peace with his children. That silence cut deeper than any argument ever could. Later, behind closed doors, Brooke confronted Ridge, her voice shaking as she asked the question she'd been avoiding since their wedding night. "Did you marry me because you wanted me? Or because you didn't want to lose me?" Ridge bristled, accused her of being insecure, of sabotaging their happiness before it even had a chance. But Brooke stood her ground, tears streaming down her face as she told him she refused to live in a marriage where she was constantly competing with his past, his children's resentment, and his unresolved feelings for another woman. Ridge stormed out that night, and as Brooke sat alone once again, the weight of reality finally settled in. This marriage wasn't struggling because of one dramatic betrayal or scandal, but because of years of emotional neglect, repeated patterns, and a refusal to truly change. The shocking truth was that Brooke and Ridge loved each other deeply, fiercely, but love had never been their problem. The problem was courage, the courage to choose each other without reservation, the courage to confront their own flaws, and the courage to finally break the cycle that had defined their relationship for decades. Without that, Brooke knew, no amount of vows or romantic declarations would save them. As the days passed, whispers began to circulate, at Forrester Creations, among family members, even within Brooke's own heart, that their latest reunion might already be unraveling. Taylor remained a steady presence, Thomas continued to push his narrative, and Ridge found himself pulled in three directions, paralyzed by the impossible task of pleasing everyone while ultimately satisfying no one. And Brooke, stronger yet more vulnerable than ever, faced a devastating realization. This time, walking away might hurt less than staying and slowly losing herself. Whether Brooke and Ridge could survive these three shocking threats remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: their marriage, once hailed as destiny fulfilled, was already standing on dangerously fragile ground, and the next choice either of them made could change everything forever. The morning after Ridge walked out, Brooke barely slept, her mind looping through every version of their argument, every pause where he could have chosen her and didn't, every silence that felt louder than shouting, and as dawn crept through the windows, she understood something she'd never fully allowed herself to admit before. This marriage wasn't just fragile, it was unbalanced, and she was the one doing most of the emotional holding while Ridge remained perpetually torn between past and present, duty and desire, certainty and escape. Brooke rose from the couch where she'd spent the night, her body stiff, her heart heavier than it had been in years, and she walked upstairs to the bedroom they were supposed to be sharing, only to find it untouched, cold, and painfully empty. The sight alone felt symbolic, like a warning she could no longer ignore. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she felt a quiet, terrifying clarity settle in. A sense that she was standing at the edge of a decision that could define the rest of her life. At Forrester Creations later that morning, Ridge buried himself in work, pretending that sketches and meetings could drown out the echoes of Brooke's words. He told himself he needed space, that walking away was better than saying something he couldn't take back. But deep down, he knew he was avoiding the truth. Brooke hadn't been wrong. He had hesitated. He had let his children's discomfort dictate his silence. And worst of all, he had allowed Taylor's steady presence to make him question whether choosing Brooke yet again was an act of love or stubborn habit. When Steffi stopped by his office and gently asked how Brooke was doing, Ridge snapped defensively, insisting that Brooke was overreacting and that everything would blow over. But Steffi saw through him immediately. She reminded him, calmly but firmly, that Brooke had lived for decades under the shadow of Taylor's place in his life, and that asking her to simply accept that dynamic without reassurance was unfair. Ridge bristled at the implication, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. Meanwhile, Brooke found herself at the cabin, the place where she and Ridge had both fallen apart and found each other again more times than she could count. The quiet there was different. less oppressive, more honest. And as she walked through the familiar rooms, memories flooded in uninvited. Every reconciliation, every passionate reunion, every promise that this time would be different played in her mind like a highlight reel of hope followed by heartbreak. She realized that she had always believed their love story was epic because it endured so much pain. But now she wondered if the pain was the point, if the drama had become the glue holding them together. Sitting by the fireplace, Brooke finally allowed herself to cry, not for what she might lose, but for how long she had accepted emotional instability as romance. Back in Los Angeles, Taylor sensed the shift immediately. She didn't celebrate it, didn't scheme or smile privately the way Brooke sometimes accused her of doing. Instead, she felt a complicated mix of concern and inevitability. Taylor had always believed that Ridge and Brooke were drawn together by chemistry and chaos, while she offered something calmer, more sustainable. When Ridge showed up at her place that evening, unannounced and emotionally exhausted, Taylor listened without judgment as he spoke in circles about Brooke's insecurity, Thomas's progress, Steffi's loyalty, and his own confusion. Taylor didn't push him to leave Brooke, but she didn't defend Brooke either. She simply said something that lingered long after Ridge left. Love shouldn't feel like a constant battle for emotional survival. That sentence echoed in Ridge's mind like a verdict he wasn't ready to accept. Thomas, for his part, watched everything unfold with unsettling calm. He insisted to Hope that he wanted peace, that his only concern was his father's happiness, but Hope couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was quietly relieved by the tension between Brooke and Ridge. When she confronted him, asking whether he truly supported his father's marriage, Thomas responded carefully, saying he supported his father being emotionally safe. Hope heard what he didn't say, that Brooke was still seen as a threat, a destabilizing force, and that Thomas believed time was on his side. The realization chilled her. She loved Brooke, but she also loved Thomas, and being caught between them felt like reliving the worst chapters of her own life. When Brooke and Ridge finally spoke again days later, it wasn't explosive, it was worse. It was restrained, polite, painfully distant. Ridge came to the cabin expecting anger, tears, accusations, but Brooke greeted him with a calm resolve that unsettled him. She told him she'd been thinking not about Taylor or Thomas specifically, but about patterns, about how often Ridge asked her to bend, to understand, to compromise while rarely offering the same in return. She asked him whether he truly believed their marriage could thrive while his loyalty remained divided, while his children felt entitled to undermine her place in his life. Ridge tried to reassure her, but his words felt recycled, familiar, worn thin by time. Brooke stopped him gently and said the words that finally cracked his composure. "I don't want to be your default choice anymore." That statement forced Ridge to confront a truth he'd spent years avoiding, that he had always assumed Brooke would forgive, would stay, would fight for them no matter what. He realized, too late perhaps, that Brooke's strength was not infinite, and that her patience was not proof of weakness, but of hope that was now dangerously close to extinction. He asked her what she wanted, really wanted, and Brooke admitted that she didn't know anymore. She wanted peace. She wanted partnership. She wanted to wake up without bracing herself for the next emotional blow. And for the first time she wasn't sure Ridge could give her that. As word of their separation, temporary though it was, spread through the family, sides were quietly taken. Eric urged Ridge to fight for his marriage, reminding him of the years he'd wasted going back and forth, while Steffi remained torn between loyalty to her father and empathy for Brooke's pain. Even Katie stepped in, warning Ridge that Brooke was different this time, that she wasn't threatening to leave, she was preparing to. The weight of that distinction finally hit Ridge like a punch to the gut. This wasn't another cycle. This was a reckoning. The three threats Brooke had sensed now loomed larger than ever. Taylor represented the road not taken, the promise of calm that tempted Ridge whenever things with Brooke became too intense. Thomas embodied unresolved trauma and misplaced loyalty, a constant reminder that Ridge's priorities were forever split. And Brooke and Ridge themselves, their shared inability to fully break free from old roles, were the greatest danger of all. Love, as powerful as it was, had become entangled with habit, guilt, and fear, and untangling it might require letting go. As the days stretched on without resolution, Brooke faced a choice she never imagined making so soon after saying "I do." She could stay and keep fighting for a marriage that demanded more sacrifice than joy, or she could walk away before resentment replaced love entirely. Ridge, meanwhile, stood at a crossroads of his own, forced to decide whether he was finally willing to choose Brooke without hesitation, without emotional escape routes, or whether admitting defeat would be kinder than continuing a cycle that left them both wounded. In true Bold and the Beautiful fashion, no decision would come easily, no consequence would be small, and no heart would remain untouched. But one thing was undeniable. Brooke and Ridge's marriage was no longer living on promises and passion alone. It was hanging on by truth or the lack of it. And the next move either of them made could permanently change not just their future, but the very legacy of one of daytime television's most iconic love stories. The silence between Brooke and Ridge stretched into something heavy and oppressive, the kind of quiet that didn't promise healing but warned of endings, and Brooke felt it every morning she woke up at the cabin alone, no longer reaching for Ridge out of habit, no longer bracing herself for the disappointment of finding him absent, because the truth was already there, settled and undeniable. She began to move through her days differently, less reactive, more deliberate, as though she were slowly reclaiming pieces of herself she had surrendered over the years in the name of love. She took long walks, letting the crisp air clear her thoughts, and with each step she confronted the painful realization that she had spent decades fighting for a man who had never fully learned how to fight for her without reservation. Loving Ridge had always felt like running a marathon with no finish line. And now for the first time, Brooke wondered what it might feel like to simply stop running. Ridge, on the other hand, felt unmoored. Without Brooke's presence grounding him, the world seemed sharper, harsher, filled with unanswered questions he could no longer push aside. He found himself replaying moments from their past. Not the grand romantic reunions, but the small, quiet ones where Brooke had offered him unwavering loyalty, even when he didn't deserve it. He remembered how she defended him to others, how she absorbed blame that wasn't hers, how she stayed when leaving would have been easier. The realization came too slowly, like a bruise blooming after the impact. He had taken Brooke's love for granted because it had always been there. And now that it wasn't, he didn't know who he was without it. Taylor sensed Ridge's unraveling but resisted the urge to step into the role everyone expected her to play. She had done that before, offering comfort that turned into hope, stability that slowly morphed into expectation, and she refused to repeat the cycle unless Ridge was truly free, emotionally and decisively. When Ridge confessed that he felt like he was losing Brooke for good, Taylor didn't reassure him that fate would bring them back together. Instead, she told him something that forced him to confront his own contradictions. That love wasn't about choosing the person who knew him best, but the person he was willing to change for. Ridge left that conversation shaken, realizing that even Taylor, the supposed safe harbor, was no longer willing to enable his indecision. Meanwhile, Brooke's world began to subtly shift. Katie encouraged her to imagine a life not defined by Ridge, one where her worth wasn't measured by his choices or his children's approval. Hope, too, offered quiet support, admitting that watching her mother endure years of emotional turbulence had shaped her own fears about love and commitment. Hearing that hit Brooke harder than any argument with Ridge ever had. She began to understand that staying in a broken cycle didn't just hurt her. It taught the next generation that pain was a prerequisite for love. That realization strengthened her resolve more than anger ever could. Thomas, watching Brooke grow steadier and Ridge grow more fractured, felt a complex mix of satisfaction and unease. This wasn't unfolding exactly as he'd imagined. Brooke wasn't spiraling, wasn't lashing out, wasn't making herself the villain. She was stepping back with dignity, and that made it harder to justify the narrative Thomas had long clung to, that she was the source of all chaos. When Hope confronted him again, asking whether he truly believed his father would be happier without Brooke, Thomas hesitated for the first time. He admitted that he didn't know, but that uncertainty scared him more than certainty ever had. For years, blame had been his anchor. Without it, he was forced to face his own role in the family's fractures. The turning point came during a family gathering Eric insisted on hosting, a final attempt to bring everyone together before lines were permanently drawn. Brooke attended reluctantly, composed and calm, while Ridge arrived visibly tense, as though walking into a reckoning he could no longer delay. The room buzzed with unspoken tension as old loyalties collided with new realities. When Eric asked Brooke and Ridge to speak, really speak, about where they stood, Brooke surprised everyone by refusing to dramatize the moment. She didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She simply said that she loved Ridge, but she loved herself too, and that for the first time in her life, she wasn't willing to sacrifice one for the other. Ridge finally broke. In front of his family, he admitted that his inability to choose fully had cost him more than he realized, that by trying to keep everyone close, he had pushed Brooke away. He acknowledged that Thomas's past actions had demanded stronger boundaries, that Taylor's presence required clearer lines, and that his marriage couldn't survive on nostalgia alone. The confession was raw, imperfect, and overdue. But Brooke, watching him bare his soul, felt something unexpected. Not relief but exhaustion. Words, no matter how sincere, no longer felt like enough. Later that night, alone together for the first time in weeks, Brooke told Ridge the truth she'd been carrying since the cabin. That she needed time apart, not as a threat or a test, but as a necessity. She needed to rediscover who she was without constantly reacting to his conflicts. Ridge wanted to argue, to promise change, to beg if necessary, but something in Brooke's eyes stopped him. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a boundary. And for the first time, Ridge respected it. As they parted, neither knowing whether this was a pause or an ending, the weight of their shared history hung between them like a question mark. The three threats that once loomed separately, Taylor, Thomas, and their own destructive patterns, had converged into a single truth. Love without accountability was no longer enough. Whether Brooke and Ridge would find their way back to each other stronger and wiser, or finally accept that some love stories are meant to evolve rather than endure, remained uncertain. What was certain, however, was that the bold and the beautiful had once again proven its most enduring truth, that the most devastating drama doesn't come from sudden betrayals or shocking secrets, but from the slow, painful realization that love, no matter how powerful, must grow or let go. And as Brooke walked away that night, not in anger but in clarity, she stepped into a future undefined by Ridge Forrester for the first time in her adult life, leaving behind a man who might finally learn that choosing too late can be the most heartbreaking choice of all.